The winter of 1692 was exceptionally cold in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. An icy wind howled through the rough wooden structures of Salem Village, rattling the leaded glass windows and chilling the inhabitants to the bone. Inside the parsonage, the fire flickered weakly against the encroaching darkness of the wilderness that surrounded the small settlement. It was a time of deep anxiety and rigid belief, where the devil was not a metaphor but a physical presence waiting in the shadows. No one could have predicted that this isolated farming community was about to become the epicenter of the most notorious case of mass hysteria in American history. The events that unfolded here would leave a stain on the conscience of a nation that remains visible more than 3 centuries later. Salem Village was distinct from the more prosperous Salem town nearby. The village was a collection of scattered farms and agrarian families who felt marginalized by the merchant class of the town. Tensions simmered over property lines, grazing rights, and church taxes. The villagers were known for their squabbles and their inability to agree on a minister. This internal conflict created a fertile ground for suspicion and resentment. In this harsh environment, neighbors watched neighbors with wary eyes, looking for any sign of deviation from the strict Puritan code that governed their lives. The fear of the supernatural was woven into the fabric of their daily existence, making the leap from petty grievance to spiritual warfare terrifyingly short. At the center of the coming storm was the household of Reverend Samuel Parris. He was a failed merchant-turned-minister who had brought his family and 2 enslaved servants from Barbados to this cold northern outpost. Parris was a rigid man who preached fire and brimstone, constantly reminding his congregation of their sinful nature. His household was a place of strict discipline and little joy. His 9-year-old daughter Betty Parris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams lived under his roof. These 2 young girls, bored by the long winter and stifled by the oppressive atmosphere, would soon become the catalysts for a tragedy that would claim innocent lives. In January of 1692, strange behaviors began to manifest in the Parris household. Betty and Abigail started to suffer from inexplicable fits. They would scream in pain, throw things around the room, and contort their bodies into impossible positions. They crawled under furniture and made guttural sounds that terrified their parents. The girls claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible agents. Their behavior was shocking and completely alien to the orderly world of the Puritans. Reverend Parris tried to keep the afflictions quiet at first, praying over the children, but the disturbances only grew more violent and frequent. Desperate for answers, Reverend Parris called for the local physician named Dr. William Griggs. The doctor examined the girls thoroughly, but could find no physical cause for their suffering. There was no fever, no rash, and no known injury that could explain the convulsions. In the 17th century, when medicine failed to provide a natural explanation, the diagnosis often turned to the supernatural. Dr. Griggs looked grave as he delivered his verdict to the worried father. He declared that the girls were under the influence of an evil hand. This diagnosis of witchcraft sent a shockwave of terror through the community. While the Reverend prayed, a neighbor named Mary Sibley suggested a folk remedy to discover the identity of the witch tormenting the girls. She instructed Tituba, the enslaved woman in the Parris household, to bake a witch cake. This cake was made from rye meal mixed with the urine of the afflicted children and then fed to a dog. The belief was that the dog would consume the spell and reveal the witch. When Reverend Parris discovered this act of counter magic, he was furious, believing it had opened the door to the devil. However, the damage was done. The girls, pressed to name their tormentors, finally pointed their fingers at 3 women. The first 3 names whispered by the afflicted girls were Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, These women were easy targets for a community looking for scapegoats. Tituba was a foreigner and a servant with different cultural customs. Sarah Good was a destitute beggar who smoked a pipe and wandered from house to house. Sarah Osborne was an elderly woman who had not attended church in over a year due to illness and was involved in a legal dispute with the Putnam family. None of these women fit the mold of the pious Puritan mother. They were outsiders within their own village, making them the perfect candidates for suspicion. Tituba is a figure shrouded in mystery and historical debate. Brought from Barbados by Paris, she likely cared for the children and may have told them stories from her homeland. In the eyes of the Puritan court, she represented the unknown and the dangerous. While Good and Osborne staunchly denied the accusations, maintaining their innocence in the face of aggressive questioning, Tituba took a different path. Perhaps realizing that denial meant certain death, or perhaps coerced by Paris, she decided to talk. Her testimony would transform a local curiosity into a colony-wide hunt for a satanic conspiracy. On February 29th, warrants were issued for the arrest of the three women. Two magistrates from Salem town, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, arrived to conduct the initial examinations. The hearing took place in the meeting house, which was packed with curious and frightened onlookers. When the accused women were brought in, the afflicted girls fell into violent fits, screaming that the spirits of the women were attacking them right there in the courtroom. This spectacle served as immediate and visceral proof to the observers. The magistrates did not act as impartial judges, but rather as prosecutors, assuming guilt from the outset. When it was Tituba's turn to speak, she gave the magistrates exactly what they feared most. She confessed to witchcraft. She described seeing the devil, who appeared to her as a black dog or a tall man in black clothes. She claimed he had forced her to sign his book in blood. Most chillingly, she told the court that there were other names in the book, names she could not read. She spoke of flying through the air on sticks and of strange red cats. Her vivid confession confirmed the existence of a diabolic plot in Salem. By stating there were other witches, she ensured the investigation would not end with just the three of them. The confession ignited a firestorm of hysteria. If the devil was recruiting in Salem, anyone could be a suspect. The afflicted girls, now joined by others like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mary Walcott, became the most powerful people in the village. They held the power of life and death in their pointing fingers. They began to accuse more people, and the profile of the accused shifted. It was no longer just the outcasts and the poor. Upstanding members of the church and wealthy landowners began to fall under the shadow of suspicion. The paranoia was absolute. No one was safe from the accusation of being in league with the devil. One of the most shocking accusations was leveled against Martha Corey. She was a covenanting member of the church and a woman known for her piety. However, she had been skeptical of the girls' claims from the beginning, openly questioning the validity of their fits. Her skepticism was interpreted as a sign of guilt. If she did not believe the accusers, she must be trying to hide her own involvement. Her arrest sent a clear message to the community that doubt was dangerous. Even a lifetime of Christian devotion was no shield against the cries of the afflicted. The community was further rocked by the arrest of Rebecca Nurse. She was 71 years old, a frail and sickly grandmother who was widely respected as a saintly woman. The accusation against her seemed impossible to many, yet the girls claimed her specter was tormenting them. Her family had long-standing land disputes with the Putnams, leading many historians to believe her accusation was fueled by a vendetta rather than genuine suspicion of witchcraft. Despite a petition signed by dozens of neighbors attesting to her good character, she was bound in chains and thrown into prison. The jails in Salem, Ipswich and Boston began to overflow with the accused. The conditions were horrific. The prisoners were kept in dark, freezing dungeons, often chained to the walls. They were charged for their own food and bedding, and those who could not pay suffered the most. The air was thick with the stench of filth and despair. Families were torn apart as mothers were dragged away from infants and husbands from wives. In this claustrophobic darkness, the accused waited for their trials, many praying for deliverance that would never come. In May of 1692, the new royal governor, Sir William Phips, arrived in Massachusetts. Faced with the growing crisis and the overflowing jails, he established a special court to hear the cases. This was the court of oyer and terminer, meaning to hear and to determine. He appointed William Stoughton as the chief magistrate. Stoughton was a man of intense rigidity and a firm believer in the reality of witchcraft. He was determined to root out the evil from the colony, regardless of the cost. Under his guidance, the court would abandon traditional legal protections in favor of hunting witches. The most controversial aspect of the trials was the admission of spectral evidence. This legal concept allowed the accusers to testify that they saw the shape or spirit of the accused committing crimes, even if the physical person was elsewhere. The logic was that the devil could not assume the shape of an innocent person without their permission. This meant that if the girls said they saw the spirit of Rebecca Nurse pinching them, it was taken as irrefutable proof of her guilt. The accused had no way to defend themselves against this. How does one prove where their spirit was? Bridget Bishop was the first to face the full force of this new court. She was a tavern owner who dressed in flashy red bodices and had been the subject of gossip for years. She had been accused of witchcraft before but had been cleared. This time, the outcome was different. Despite her protests of innocence, the spectral evidence and the testimony of neighbors about minor quarrels sealed her fate. On June 10th, she was taken to a rocky ledge known as Gallows Hill. She was the first to hang, her body left swinging as a grim warning to the village. The executions did not stop the accusations, they only fueled them. In July, 5 more women were brought to the gallows, including Sarah Good and Rebecca Nurse. Before the rope was placed around her neck, Sarah Good was urged by a minister to confess. She shouted back a defiant curse that would become legendary. She told the minister that she was no more a witch than he was a wizard, and that if he took her life, God would give him blood to drink. Years later, that minister would indeed die from a hemorrhage, choking on his own blood, keeping the legend alive. The hysteria reached a fever pitch with the accusation of George Burroughs. He was a former minister of Salem Village who had moved to Maine. He was physically strong and had been involved in financial disputes with the Putnam family. The accusers claimed he was the ringleader of the witches, the dark priest of their satanic coven. He was arrested in Maine and dragged back to Salem. His trial was a sensation. The idea that a man of God could be the leader of the devil's army shook the Puritan faith to its core. On August 19th, George Burroughs stood on the ladder at the gallows. The crowd expected him to falter or to be unable to speak holy words, as it was believed a witch could not recite the Lord's Prayer without stumbling. To the shock of everyone present, Burroughs recited the prayer perfectly, with solemnity and calm. The crowd grew restless, some calling for his release. But Cotton Mather, a prominent minister observing the execution, reminded them that the devil could appear as an angel of light. The executioner completed his grim task, and the minister was hanged. Alongside Burroughs, 4 other men were executed that day, including John Proctor. Proctor was a wealthy farmer who had been an outspoken critic of the trials from the start. He had dismissed the girls as liars and had forbidden his own servant from attending the hearings. His skepticism cost him his life. In prison, he wrote a moving letter to the clergy in Boston, pleading for the trials to be moved or for new judges to be appointed, claiming that innocent blood was being shed. His plea fell on deaf ears, and the machinery of death continued to grind forward. The investigation took a darker turn with the Carrier family. Martha Carrier was accused, and to secure evidence against her, the magistrates turned their attention to her children. Her young sons were tied neck to heels until the blood gushed from their noses. Under this brutal torture, the children confessed to being witches and implicated their mother. This use of torture to extract confessions from children marked a new low point in the proceedings. It demonstrated that the court was willing to destroy families and violate all norms of decency to prove their theories. By September, the frenzy was uncontrollable. On September 22nd, 8 more people were hanged in a single day. The cart carrying the condemned creaked its way up Gallows Hill, followed by a jeering mob. The bodies were thrown into a shallow crevice in the rocks, denied a Christian burial. The stench of death hung over Salem. The sheer number of executions began to weigh on the community. People started to wonder how many witches could possibly be in one small village. The initial certainty was beginning to fracture, replaced by a creeping dread. One of the most harrowing episodes involved Giles Corey, the 81-year-old husband of Martha Corey. He had been accused of witchcraft, but refused to enter a plea. He knew that if he pleaded innocent, he would be found guilty and his property would be seized by the state, leaving his heirs with nothing. By standing mute, he could not be tried. To force a plea, the sheriff subjected him to a torture known as peine forte et dure. He was stripped naked, placed in a pit, and heavy stones were piled onto a board on his chest. For 2 days, Giles Corey lay under the crushing weight. The sheriff asked him repeatedly to plead, but the old man only gasped out 2 words: more weight. He refused to give the court the satisfaction of a trial. He died under the pressure of the stones, his tongue pressed out of his mouth. It was a brutal and defiant end. His death was the only one of its kind in the history of the United States. His stubborn resistance became a symbol of the terrible injustice of the trials. The turning point came when the accusations reached too high. The afflicted girls, emboldened by their power, began to name people connected to the highest levels of government. They accused the wife of Governor Phipps. This was a step too far. The governor, who had been away fighting wars on the frontier, returned to find his own household under threat. He realized the court he had created was out of control. The spectral evidence that had condemned so many was now threatening the social order of the entire colony. Influential ministers like Increase Mather began to speak out against the court's methods. Mather wrote a treatise titled Cases of Conscience concerning evil spirits, in which he famously stated that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. This shift in theological opinion was crucial. It provided the political cover needed to stop the trials. The definition of evidence was tightened, and spectral evidence was no longer admissible. Without the ability to use dreams and visions as proof, the cases against the remaining prisoners collapsed. In October of 1692, Governor Phipps dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. He prohibited further arrests and eventually released the remaining prisoners. The jails emptied, but the tragedy was far from over. The released prisoners returned to ruined homes and neglected farms. They were billed for their time in jail, and many were financially destitute. The community of Salem was shattered. The trust between neighbors had been obliterated, replaced by shame and bitterness. The dead could not be brought back, and the living had to find a way to coexist with those who had accused them. The aftermath of the trials was a long and painful process of reckoning. In 1697, The General Court of Massachusetts declared a day of fasting and repentance for the tragedy. One of the judges, Samuel Sewall, stood before the congregation in Boston while his apology was read aloud, accepting the blame and shame for his role in the condemnations. It was a public admission that the justice system had failed catastrophically. The jurors also signed a statement asking for forgiveness, admitting they had been deluded by the powers of darkness. Years later, in 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., one of the primary accusers, stood before her church and offered a public apology. She claimed that she had not acted out of malice, but had been deceived by Satan. She asked for forgiveness from the families of those she had helped to kill, particularly the Nurse family. While some accepted her apology, the scars ran too deep for others. The apology highlighted the tragic role of the children, who had been used as instruments of a deadly hysteria. In 1711, the colony passed a bill restoring the good names of some of the victims and providing financial restitution to their heirs. However, it would take centuries for all the victims to be formally exonerated. The legal and social wounds took generations to heal. Salem Village eventually changed its name to Danvers to distance itself from the infamy, but the shadow of 1692 remained. The trials became a cautionary tale about the dangers of extremism, the failure of due process, and the fragility of justice. Historians and scientists have spent centuries trying to explain what happened in Salem. One prominent theory is ergotism. This theory suggests that the rye grain in the village was infected with a fungus called ergot, which contains chemicals similar to LSD. Consumption of this tainted bread could have caused hallucinations, convulsions, and the sensation of crawling skin. If the girls were suffering from ergot poisoning, their fits were real, but their interpretation of them as witchcraft was a cultural delusion. This biological explanation offers a tragic twist to the narrative. Another theory focuses on the psychological phenomenon of mass psychogenic illness, formerly known as mass hysteria. In a closed, repressed society like Salem, stress and fear could manifest as physical symptoms. The girls, starved for attention and terrified of damnation, may have subconsciously mimicked each other's behaviors. Once the adults validated their fits as witchcraft, the cycle reinforced itself. This theory suggests that the mind is capable of creating its own monsters when placed under extreme pressure. Economic and political factors also played a significant role. The map of the accusations shows a clear divide. The accusers largely came from the agrarian, traditional Salem village, while the accused often lived near the road to the more cosmopolitan Salem town. The trials can be seen as a backlash by the old Puritan order against the rising merchant class and the changing times. The accusations were a way to strike out at those who represented a threat to the traditional way of life. Today, the Salem Witch Trials stand as a dark monument to the dangers of fear and intolerance. 19 people were hanged, one man was pressed to death, and several others died in prison. The legacy of Salem is not just a story of witches, but a story of a society turning on itself. It serves as a permanent reminder of what happens when fear overrides reason, and when the law becomes a weapon of persecution. As we look back at the graves on Gallows Hill, we are reminded that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we like to believe.